Hey everybody, good to see you. Hopefully you can all hear me. So we're joined here today by the Humanitarian Coordinator for Sudan, Clementine Nkweta-Salami, and she'll be delivering some brief opening remarks, and then we'll take your questions. So please go ahead.
Amanda. Okay, is my microphone on? Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Sudan's civilians have suffered through almost 7 months of intense conflict and a humanitarian tragedy that only grows bleaker by the day. As the fighting continues to rage, over half of the population, 25 million people, require assistance and protection. More than 6 million people have fled their homes and are displaced inside Sudan or in neighbouring countries. They are not just numbers. They are individuals whose lives have been uprooted and changed forever. The statement of commitments adopted in Jeddah earlier in the week by the parties to the conflict in Sudan marks a moment of truth for the country. We owe it to the people of Sudan to ensure that the promises made by the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces to protect civilians and provide unimpeded humanitarian access are kept. These obligations include protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure. But as we have seen since the conflict erupted in April, very little has been spared. Even hospitals have been attacked, destroyed, or occupied. We have recently received disturbing reports about escalating violence and attacks against civilians, including what appears to be on an ethnic basis in Darfur. I will continue to call for all the parties to Sudan's conflict to abide by their obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. This is not optional. These attacks should cease and those responsible held accountable. The spread of fighting to Al Jazeera's state, Sudan's breadbasket, could push even more people into hunger. The health sector has been decimated, and more than 70% of health facilities in conflict areas are out of service. This is extremely worrying, not least given the ongoing disease outbreaks such as cholera, dengue, malaria, and measles. We keep saying that the situation is horrific and grim, but frankly, we are running out of words to describe the horror of what is happening in Sudan. We continue to receive unrelenting and appalling reports of sexual and gender-based violence, enforced disappearance, arbitrary detentions, and grave violations of human and children's rights. What is happening is verging on pure evil. The protection of civilians continues to be of major concern. What keeps me awake at night are the faces of the people I have met in Sudan, people like you and I who desperately want to live in peace, feed their families, get health care, and send their children to school. These are the people humanitarians are trying to reach, and we are delivering. More than 4.1 million people have received life-saving assistance since the conflict erupted, including in South Kordofan's capital, Kadugli, for the first time since April, with the arrival of supplies after intense negotiations. Every step in delivering aid involves multiple steps that consume time and resources. Those reached are not enough. We must reach many, many more, and that's why it's so critical to improve humanitarian access despite insecurity, bureaucracy, and other challenges. The access and bureaucratic challenges posed by the conflict and the parties to it must be eliminated wholesale. Funding is also a major issue. So far, we have received just over a third of the 2.6 billion needed for this year's humanitarian response. Donors have been generous, but Sudan's people need sustained support. In addition to impediments and funding, maintaining the attention of the world is a daunting challenge. The world is beset by crises, many that garner much more attention than the crisis in Sudan for a multitude of factors, but not because of the scale of the crisis or the depth of misery. In this regard, the Sudan crisis has few equals. We remain dedicated to ensuring that the suffering of Sudan's people, especially the women, children, elderly, and people with disabilities who are Sudan's most vulnerable and escapably caught up in this war, are neither forgotten nor ignored. We will also continue to stress the global obligations we all share to end that suffering and foster peace and reconciliation. If we don't act now, Sudan risks becoming a protracted crisis where there is little hope and fewer dreams. We cannot let this happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll take some questions in the room and then on the screen. If you can introduce yourself before asking your question would be great, and we'll start with Edie.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. First, you said that many more people need help. How many more, and what's the level of hunger that actually exists in Sudan today? I assume there are many areas that you can't get to. I know that it's very difficult to get to West Darfur, for example. And have you seen any signs that the rival forces are actually implementing the agreement that they reached a week ago to protect civilians? Thank you.
Thank you very much. By our estimates, we have about 24.7 million people in need, and that is about half of Sudan's population. Of this number, during the course of this year, we are targeting about 12 million. But as you have heard, and as we continue to report, the numbers continue to grow. In terms of the hunger levels, let me perhaps just say that what we see is rising hunger. We have access challenges trying to meet those in the cities that are besieged. But what I think is also very clear, and I must underline, is that there are high levels of malnutrition within the young population, babies, very young children, and this is of particular concern. We try to target this group as a matter of priority, but my fear is that without additional resources, without additional access and facilitated access to enable us reach these populations, these numbers will grow even more. The levels we will perhaps possibly reach, if this continues, is close to about 15 million by early next year. So we are working against trying to make sure that we can get into those particular locations the relevant assistance required.
And when you say 50 million, that's 50 million people needing...
15 million people facing acute food insecurity.
And whether you've seen any signs of the rival...
Oh, yes. Unfortunately not. I think one of our objectives, you may know, is that we will be launching on Monday the Humanitarian Forum. That is a commitment made by the two parties. We'll establish this forum, and OCHA, the UN's Agency for Humanitarian Coordination, will be part of this forum, and we hope, once the forum has been launched, that we will be able to operationalize and implement these commitments. And that will, I would suggest, be the true test of the parties' commitments to uphold these principles, as well as to provide access and lift some of the challenges that we are confronting.
Amelie, please.
Amélie Bottelier from AFP News Agency. You said the situation in Sudan is verging pure evil, and you mentioned in Darfur especially ethnic-based violence. How worried are you that we're going to see a repetition of what happened 20 years ago in Darfur? Thank you.
We are very worried, and we continue to raise the alarm about the situation on the ground, and we continue to engage with the parties to try and ensure that they uphold their obligations to protect civilians. I mean, this is what international humanitarian law requires. We know from some of the populations that have fled to Chad that some of the stories of what they experienced and the causes of their flight are quite harrowing. So are we concerned? Yes, we are concerned, and we will continue to hope that we don't find ourselves treading down the same path.
Anade, please.
Hi, Anade Sitima, Al Jazeera English. Following up on that, you mentioned earlier, obviously, that there's struggles maintaining global attention on Sudan. And so when it comes to putting pressures on parties to uphold humanitarian law and protect civilians, what options does the UN have pragmatically given the context globally?
Well, we have, I think, the options are to continue raising the alarm about what we see on the ground, to continue asking our donors and those with leverage over the two parties to engage with them and to try and make sure we can gradually move towards a cessation of hostilities. We also feel it is important for us to continue to appeal for additional resources because we have to scale up. We hope coming out of the humanitarian forum, we will get access to some of the hard-to-reach areas. And once that access has been achieved, then of course we will need to have the resources to ensure that we can comprehensively respond to the needs of the population.
Stefano?
Thank you, Stefano Vaccaro, New York. How would you consider what the African Union is doing at the moment to try to stop this fighting? I mean, do you think the African Union is doing everything is possible or it's not being active enough?
I think the African Union is at this point in time working with the UN and working with also some of the co-conveners of the Jeddah platform to try and engage with the parties and to try and move not only for access by the humanitarians, but also to ensure that we can move towards a ceasefire. At the Jeddah platform, IGAD, which is the regional commission for that part of Africa, is present. IGAD is representing the AU, and they are part of the talks that have taken place at the recent Jeddah meetings. So I do believe that they are engaged. I do believe that everybody is trying their best at this point in time to coordinate efforts and to make sure that we speak with one voice in relation to what needs to be done.
Maggie?
Hi, Margaret Bashir, Voice of America. Thank you, Clementine, for being here. Just who represented the UN at the Jeddah talks? You were in them originally, right? Mr. Griffiths went at one point, if I'm not mistaken.
He was there, what we call Jeddah 1. We're now talking about Jeddah 2. He was there, but we had our OCHA team in Jeddah. We had a gentleman who was working with the two parties, a colleague who had also been present in the Jeddah 1 talks, and they were part of our team. We hope that once the platform is launched, we will then send a smaller team to Jeddah who will remain in Jeddah and who will ensure that the engagement with the parties around some of these key priorities and some of the key decisions, and also our efforts to have them operationalize the commitments, that we keep the momentum going. And this discussion and dialogue continues in a way that has an impact on the work that we're doing on the ground.
And if I could ask just a couple operational follow-ups. When this all began in mid-April, the UN moved a lot of the staff to Port Sudan. You had relocated some staff even, I think, to Kenya perhaps, or out of Sudan. Can you just give us an update on how many staff are still there, where you're operating, where you're based? And it's practically mid-November already, and if you're still so short of funding, even if you do get access, what are you realistically going to be able to do if you don't have resources?
Perhaps let me take the first question in relation to the UN presence on the ground. You're quite right. At the height of the onset of the conflict, we moved our staff to Port Sudan, but many of them never left the country. Some of them left temporarily, others moved to the east, where we've enjoyed relative security since the conflict started, and where indeed many of the displaced are now present. And we continue to support them in those locations. In Port Sudan, we have a very small UN team. The presence in Port Sudan is really more administrative as well as an engagement with the authorities, but the work is in the field. And security permitting, we have tried to deploy as many of our colleagues to the field as possible. And these are essentially, I should say, humanitarian agencies, international NGOs, and we also have a very strong national NGO presence as well. We do have in Nairobi our political team, and they are carrying out the political analysis. They're working with the African Union, IGAD, and other regional entities. We also have colleagues who are working, of course, on protection of civilians and human rights.
We'll go to Ibtisam, and then we have a question online.
Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azam, Al-Arab Al-Jadid newspaper. I have two questions. First, regarding aid delivery and access, and if you could say more to that, and whether you see the parties trying to intervene. And the other question is about, you talked about the parties outside Sudan that maybe have influence on the fighting parties and that they are engaging, etc. But my question, I guess, do you believe that these parties are, outside parties, are doing actually enough? Is it engaging and talking enough in this point, or there need to be more pressure on the ground, including maybe also the stop of weapon delivery or weapon embargo? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Before I respond perhaps to your question, I think there was a question that I forgot to respond to about the resources. So if you allow me to just come back to that very quickly. Yes, indeed, we are in November. Our funding levels are around 30%, 33%. So they are indeed very, very low. We will use the resources we have, and we are in the planning process to try and launch further appeals around our humanitarian response plan. So yes, they are low, hence my appeal that we get an injection of resources that we can ensure that we scale up. But a lot will also depend on access, because even with resources, if we don't have the access we need, then we have challenges. So we try to do both at the same time, try to get more access, demonstrate that we can deliver, and through that mobilize additional resources so that we can scale up as we believe we should. In relation to your question about aid delivery and access, access, as I've mentioned, is a key challenge. We are forced to, of course, deconflict between the various armed groups, and this takes a lot of time in terms of our ability to move our supplies from Port Sudan, the main entry point, to those locations in which we need to deliver assistance. So access is a key challenge. We want to be able to supply the routes without any hindrance. We want to be able to distribute assistance in an impartial manner, but we want also to be able to establish a presence in some of these hotspots areas so we can actually address the needs of the people and make sure that they get the support they need. In relation to whether I feel that enough pressure is being brought to bear on the parties, I do know that there are interested states that continue to work with the parties, and I believe put pressure on them so that, number one, any action that is taken with the protection of civilians in mind, but more importantly, that we can work towards a ceasefire. Pressure takes many forms. And I believe many of the states that are engaging with them are trying to see how they can bring pressure to bear in a number of areas so that we can have discussions that would lead to a ceasefire. Pardon?
Armed delivery?
Arms delivery, I believe that is part of it, but I don't have any window specifically into what the discussions are, who is doing what, but I would imagine that would also be part of the discussions as well.
And online we have a question from Michelle. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hi, thank you so much for the briefing. I also wanted to follow up on the comment you made about the violence verging on pure evil. Could you just expand on that a little bit for us? What does that look like, and what are some of the personal stories that you've heard?
I'm trying to think which of the many I should focus on. Let me say that I think we've all seen reports in the media. I've also mentioned in some of my statements some of the attacks on civilians, on the youth, on women, on people who are trying to flee Darfur to get into Chad, where they are seeking safety, women who are leaving Khartoum. And as you know, women in displacement are extremely vulnerable. I've heard stories of women getting on commercial vehicles and being pulled off the vehicles, and in some cases, young girls being raped in front of their mothers. So these are the nature of some of the violence that is taking place. And this is why I say that it really is, as I said, it borders on pure evil. And children also are caught in the crossfires in all of this as well. And we are trying, I've tried to issue statements denouncing some of these activities. I've also called, had engagements with the two parties and highlighted what it is we're hearing, the reports we are hearing, and asking them to ensure that they can identify, where we have specific reports, they can identify those that are responsible. So we are documenting that, and we hope that at some point there will be accountability. But just to say that particularly the crimes against women, particularly the indiscriminate killings, of course we've heard of crimes against the Masalit in Darfur. All these are egregious violations of human rights, and it must stop.
All right, well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much to the Humanitarian Coordinator for taking the time. And Stefan, here he comes.